Good afternoon. All right. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to Adelphi University and this afternoon lecture. My name is Holger Henke, and I'm the director of our university's new Bhisé Center for Global Understanding. Thank you. Having just joined Adelphi, I couldn't be more excited and honored to welcome all of you and our featured speaker as one of my first formal tasks. It is absolutely no exaggeration when I tell you that not just Adelphi, but really any university campus in this country and elsewhere will find itself very fortunate to host such a distinguished speaker as Dr. Amitav Ghosh is. Among numerous prizes that he has won are the Erasmus Prize, the Padma Shri, one of the highest civilian awards in India, and the Dan David Prize. I also just learned that he has 6 honorary doctoral degrees. So we can give a round of applause. Give yourself a round of applause too. Thank you. And so, Dr. Ghosh, Amitav, welcome, welcome, welcome to you especially as you join us this afternoon. Also among us, President Rorden, Provost Storm, VP Klein, and the Bhisé family, on whose generous initiative and sponsorship this lecture series and the center that bears their name rest. The conversation with Dr. Ghosh after this lecture will be led by our own Dr. Craig Carson, Professor of Literature. Welcome to all of you. The lecture series is only one of several activities that the center will continue to undertake. In addition to curriculum enhancement, study abroad opportunities, research sponsorship, invited resident artists, scholars, and writers, and much more that we hope to develop in conversation with many partners on and off our campus. In that, the center's mission will support the Bhisé family's goals, and its functions align well with Adelphi's current strategic plan, which seeks to expand global content across the university curriculum and increase support for studying abroad. And you know, as I started reading the first pages of Mr. Ghosh's recent book, Smoke and Ashes, Opium's Hidden Histories, I was immediately pulled into this fascinating subject. You see, already on page 2, Mr. Ghosh notes that his work on the opium trade is not only a story of India and China, but also one of the vast Indian Ocean that both separates and facilitated the commercial contact that brought about the opium trade. In a region that I'm fairly familiar with, the Caribbean, there are 2 eminent writers who in fact made very similar observations. One of them, Derek Walcott, who has said that sea is history, and the poet Kamau Brathwaite, who observed that the Caribbean, with its many and diverse islands in the Caribbean, the unity is submarine. And indeed, it is. It is both history and submarine unity. You see, what rests on the bottom of the Caribbean Sea, Spanish galleons, they're silver and gold, but also British, French, American, Canadian, Haitian, Venezuelan, and Cuban ships, including such that traded with the British East India Company, the bones of sailors, fishermen, slaves, and drug dealers, the ashes and hardened lava of volcanoes, some of which are underwater volcanoes, all of these things signify our common histories and perhaps destiny. So again, I am very excited to have Mr. Ghosh here today to give his stories of the history of the opium trade and what it meant for globalization. And I would now like to invite Mr. Bhisé on the stage to introduce our guest speaker. Thank you very much, and welcome again.
Thank you, Holger. Good afternoon, Adelphi, and welcome, Dr. Ghosh. I know you're backstage, but welcome anyway. Today is the fourth lecture in our series, our global project series. In one of our lectures in November of last year, we had Dr. Caroline Elkins talk about colonialism and global history and the economic and social impact of colonial rule on dozens of countries. A big part of this had to do with the economic exploitation of the colonized and the transfer of wealth from the colonized nation to the colonial nation. I can't think of a better example because very often these concepts are vague and altruistic, but talking about the opium trade, I think, is a fascinating way to understand a very important part of colonial history, which is how money was made at that time. This kind of stuff is vaguely buried in our history books, but the fundamental aspect of these legacies focus on corrupt regimes that today are considered the fountainhead of Western civilization. And even before our current period in history, this has been true for pretty much most of time. So now, we are in 2024, and we are constantly faced with false and misleading narratives, no matter where you stand politically, economically, socially, or otherwise. We spend our lives making billions of decisions which are based on information that we receive. But if the information we receive is false, or at least incomplete or tainted, then the decisions that we make based on the information we receive is also going to be negative or tainted. This is true now, but remember, this was also true in 1624, or 824, or 224, or even 424 BC. The point is that the delivery of false information by those who control it has always been the lever of control by leaders in politics, military, religion, or commerce. The launch of our academic studies under the Global Understanding Program has been the study of colonialism. While there are numerous aspects to this, a key factor remains the confluence of corruption and military barbarism. If you think those words are interesting, you will not find a better scholar on the subject than Dr. Amitav Ghosh. In his books, and specifically the Ibis trilogy, he brings to life an extraordinary group of characters that have made a significant impact in my very amateur study of the subject. Holger Henke has already gone into his awards, so I won't go into those details. But I can tell you that his books have the suspense, the drama, the adventure, and knowledge as any Jason Bourne adventure or a Mission Impossible movie. Studying the impact of colonialism for the Bhisé Global Understanding Project is not just an academic exercise. This is humanity's background. This is our history. Whether your personal heritage is colonist or colonized, arguably our biggest challenge today is disinformation. The vast majority of everything you read is partially hidden or altered. The news that are simply not facts, but simply somebody's opinion. This is perpetuated by politics, business interests, religious mafias, criminal mafias, and the worst of all, by national governments. I always quote the Akira Kurosawa film, Rashomon, which was made in 1950. It was a famous Japanese director. It was about the trial of an outlaw for the murder of a man and his rape of his wife. And there were 4 eyewitnesses to the exact same event. And when the judge asked the story of the 4 eyewitnesses, there were 4 completely and totally different accounts of what happened. The plot emphasis is on the subjectivity of truth and the uncertainty of factual accuracy, which then, by the way, was considered an esoteric curiosity, but today is the subject of day-to-day conversation. The Global Understanding Project lecture series will seek to understand the deep divisions that most nations in the world are faced in 2024 and in the years ahead. One way to address this is to examine the past, the truth about the past, the reality behind what we think is the reality of what we are told today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Amitav Ghosh.
Hello, and thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Bharat. And thank you all for being here. It's a great pleasure for me to be here at Adelphi University today. And I'm going to talk to you about my book, Smoke and Ashes. This book came about because I had written these other books before, the Ibis trilogy. And in the course of doing the research for these books, I came upon something which I knew nothing about really at the time, which is the history of opium. Now, opium is actually a very, very ancient substance. Essentially, it's co-evolved with human beings. Human beings have used the opium poppy since antiquity. You can see that early treatments of many kinds of diseases, including mental diseases, were based upon opium. Here you see ascetics preparing opium outside a rural dwelling in India. So opium basically, the really interesting thing about opium is that it starts off as a medicine. And it's a medicine with incredibly powerful properties. It can help with curing coughs, and of course it works as an anesthetic, and it has many other properties of that kind. For example, it can cure certain kinds of stomach diseases. So humans have depended on opium since, for thousands of years. But opium was usually used as a medicine. But this began to change round about the 12th and 13th centuries. So there's this curious relationship between opium and empire. The first empire that that took up opium on a large scale, using it for recreational purposes, was the Mongol Empire. So and the Turkish descendants of the Mongol Empire. So here you have. So you have these descendants. For example, the Mughal Emperor Jahangir used opium a lot for recreational purposes. But what's important to remember here is that it was a very sort of minority phenomenon. Opium was used by courtly elites in Turkish and Mughal and Persian, within the Turkish, Mughal and Persian empires. But it was very restricted. It was extremely expensive. Opium is very labor intensive to produce. So it circulated on a very small scale. But this changed after the Dutch entered entered the Indian Ocean. The Dutch effectively founded the first imperial narco state. So here's the Dutch began using opium to establish monopolies on other substances, for example, on cloves, on pepper, on nutmeg and mace, and so on. So the Dutch were the first to start dealing with these, with opium on a large scale. And then the English followed in their footsteps. So we are talking about the 17th century here. The English established their first toeholds on Indian land in the early 17th century. Essentially, the English came to India because they were driven out of Indonesia by the Dutch. And that's when they started expanding their holdings in India. And that's also when they started trading in opium. Now, the history of opium is also very closely related to the history of tea. Now, in the 17th century, from the 17th century onwards, but especially from the 18th century onwards, tea became a very, very important commodity for the British Empire. So all this tea came from China, because China at that point had virtually a sort of global trade monopoly on tea. So here you see that how tea was produced in China. This painting shows all the steps in tea production. It runs in a zigzag line from top to bottom. So through much of the 18th and 19th centuries, the tax on tea accounted for nearly 1/10 of Britain's revenues. It's astonishing to think that this huge empire becomes actually dependent on a commodity produced by China, by Chinese peasants. So it earned the British government as much as all land, property, and income taxes put together. So vast was the sum of money that it could pay for the salaries of all government servants and for all public works, buildings, etc. I mean, it's really a kind of astonishing thing. So tea was auctioned at India House, London, and tea was an exclusive monopoly of the British East India Company. So the Americans, for example, couldn't trade in tea. This became a great grievance for America. You know about the Boston Tea Party and so on. So the interesting thing is that the British, in order to buy tea, had to pay in silver, because the British didn't produce anything that the Chinese wanted, And in fact, back then, 17th century, this is how it looked like, pretty much like today, I mean, huge exports from China to the rest of the world, the English exports, not so much. So actually the Qianlong Emperor, who was a very, very a world historical figure of the 18th century, this is what he said in a letter to King George, because the British were constantly trying to open trade relations of various kinds with the Chinese. And he says, "We have never valued ingenious articles, nor do we have the slightest need of your country's manufactures." Again, as this historian, Keith McMahon, suggested, the Chinese self-sufficiency was a source of anxiety to the British, because they sensed in China the existence of another so-called rival master race. And this is a pattern that actually reproduces itself throughout European empires. For example, the Dutch recognized that Chinese merchants were very, very good merchants. So they gave them a very special place within Jakarta and so on. But then from time to time, they would also kill them all. They would inspire these riots whereby they attacked the Chinese communities in the East Indies. So what happens as I said, in India, you had two major areas of opium production. They produced opium in a very small scale way. It was a kind of peasant production of opium. And this happened in this region, in what is known as Bihar, what is today the state of Bihar, and the other was on the other side of the country in what was then known as Malwa. So this was the opium-producing region of the Bengal presidency, basically around Patna. Patna was the main main center of opium production. And this region falls into British hands in the 1760s. There's a Battle of Buxar, and then the British take over this region, and almost instantly they declare a monopoly on the opium trade. So very little was known about the specificities of the opium trade when I started writing the Ibis trilogy. But my trilogy inspired these two young historians to write these two excellent books. One is this guy, Matthew Wormer, who now teaches in, I think it's somewhere in Massachusetts, and the other is an Austrian historian called Ralph Bauer. So what they've described is actually the ways in which the British conducted their monopoly on opium. What they did was they set up something called the Opium Department. And the Opium Department had absolute control over the region in which opium was grown, which then was known as Purvanchal. Basically, it was eastern Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, what is Bihar today. So this was the place where they set up the first big opium factory. This was a place called Ghazipur. And Ghazipur, as you can see, was a very beautiful little town right on the Ganges River. And Ghazipur was the place where Lord Cornwallis, the Butcher Cornwallis of the American War of Independence. Basically he lost the American War of Independence, and as always happens in the Anglosphere, people get kicked upwards. So he ended up as Governor General of India, and he decided to go and spend a lot of time in Ghazipur because he was basically overseeing the setting up of the opium production system, and that's his tomb, which is in Ghazipur. So in Ghazipur, basically the Opium Department had two major factories. One factory was in Patna, and the other factory was in this place, Ghazipur. And this is, as you can see, it's a map of it was from a book written by J.W.S. MacArthur, who actually managed the factory for a very long time. And that factory is still there today. And this was perhaps the most lucrative factory that the British had anywhere in the world. It produced vast quantities of opium over a period of, since the 1780s. And you can see it's a kind of very colonial type institution. Inside it has churches, stuff like that, It's a complete sort of, it's a little factory town. A tenth of the population of the city of Ghazipur was employed by the Ghazipur opium factory. And this is a photograph taken in the late 19th century. And as you can see, it's a very sort of, it's a very manual form of production. Basically, they were just sort of producing opium by hand. And this is the real tragedy, the people who are doing this work, impoverished workers, impoverished peasants, producing the most lucrative article of trade of the British Empire. Essentially, opium provided 50% of the British Raj's revenues in India. It's an astonishing thing. Without opium, they would not have been able to finance their empire. And it's not surprising that 10 years after opium production was basically curtailed and the opium trade was basically curtailed by international agreements, that the British Empire basically ran out of funds. And that led to independence as well. But the peasants who still work in this Ghazipur opium factory, they're still dirt poor farmers from around from that region, which is actually one of the poorest regions of India. It used to be one of the richest regions of India, but then it became, basically through the production of opium, became one of the poorest regions of India. Basically, it's a story of the resource curse, because the British imposed this system whereby these peasants really received nothing for producing opium. They produced opium below cost. They were forced to produce opium below cost. And this opium was all produced for export to the Chinese market, Chinese and Southeast Asian market. This is the other center of opium production in India, which is the city of Patna on the river Ganges. This is the general plan of the opium factory at Patna. I love this painting. It's by this artist called Sitaram. And he's an Indian artist who traveled with the Governor General across North India. And as you can see, he's really enjoying playing with perspective. So he's painted this Patna opium factory from a sort of bird's eye view, and he's painted himself into it because that's him at the bottom. Wherever. Yeah, that's him right there at the bottom over there. And he's basically made the opium factory look like a Mughal palace. There are no people in it, as you can see, no workers, no people, because he was also producing these for basically for a European audience. So he wanted it to look nice. This is again, this is the opium go down in Patna, also painted by Sitaram, who I really think was one of the great Indian artists of the 19th century, almost unknown because his work was shut away in a British palace. And these pictures were actually produced by an Englishman. These are lithographs. They're huge lithographs produced by an Englishman called Captain Sherwill. And he presents the interior of the opium factory. But again, he's in love with perspective. So you have all these vanishing points. The Indian workers are hardly visible. Whereas you can see the supervisors are all British in European clothes. This is the drying room. Again, this is where the opium cakes were dried. And again, you can see he makes the opium factory look like a cathedral. That's even more evident here. So this is where the opium sap is brought in by the peasants and then examined by British examiners. Then you have this. This is the stacking room where the opium is actually kept. These little boys run up and down these ladders stacking the opium. And at the end of the day, they're washed down. They're stripped naked and washed down in case they're hiding any opium on their persons. That's the kind of incredible surveillance regime that actually accompanies the production of opium. Now, these pictures are produced again by an Indian artist called Shivalal, and you can see how different it is. He sees it in a completely different way. He sees it basically like any kind of Indian workshop that you would see today. So this is his vision of the drying room, which is exactly so very unlike Captain Sherwill's. Captain Sherwill was producing his pictures for an exhibition in London. So he really wanted to give the impression that the British were busy industrializing India and so on. So he made the opium factory look like a factory, but it wasn't. It was just a kind of. I love this picture by Sitaram because I think Sitaram is actually playing with Piranesi's ideas of volume and space. It's very striking. I think he must have seen Piranesi on the Piranesi's works on the walls of some colonial administrator and probably became fascinated with it. So anyway, within a very short period, because the British were continuing to import tea on a very large scale, you can see the incredible rate of development of, it's called Bengal opium because it was then the Bengal presidency, but it basically came from Bihar. So this amazing sort of surge in opium production that happens. At first, it's a very small scale industry. It ends up becoming a very large scale industry. And they're doing this essentially to provide the Chinese with a substance because they're running out of silver at this point. So now there's a very interesting thing about Indian history in the late 18th century, The British conquered eastern India and southern India relatively early. They were not able to conquer western India because they were resisted by the Maratha Confederacy, which was led by a family called the Sindhyas. And the Marathas, actually at this point, they were very innovative, forward-looking people. They copied Western armies, they recruited Western officers, and they built up a very powerful army that was actually effectively able to resist the British for a very long time until 1803, when they're defeated in a major defeat. But even after they're defeated, the British don't take over territorial control of the Maratha Confederacy. They govern those regions through indirect rule. So these kingdoms actually have a fair degree of autonomy, and they're able to run their own economic affairs. So one of the things they did, so this is this region, Malwa. This became the center of the Maratha Confederacy. And what the Marathas did was that they began to encourage their merchants to start growing opium. And they succeeded at this incredibly well. A whole network of organizations emerged that started trading in opium. And basically, in this period, really every major Indian commercial entity, especially in Western India, became involved in the production of opium. So these are two very interesting books by the same writer, Amar Farooqi, who's actually the leading Indian historian of opium. So what happened in this period is that the British tried to establish a monopoly of opium production also in Western India, but they failed. They failed because the Maratha Confederacy was able to resist them politically and militarily, but also indigenous mercantile networks in this region became extremely efficient at evading British control. So that's why his book is called Smuggling as Subversion, because he shows us how indigenous merchants were able to evade the British monopoly. And this is another very interesting book. It's basically, the economy of Bombay, today India's most important mercantile city, was founded on opium. So the British initially they tried to impose a monopoly also on the trade in opium out of Bombay, but they found that very difficult because there were many other ports that were trading in opium, like Karachi, for example. So they went into Sindh, conquered Sindh, stopped them exporting opium, because they decided that the entire Western Indian opium trade would be focused in Bombay. And this was very lucrative for them because they charged a very high tax. So they gave up trying to impose a monopoly on Malwa opium. And instead, they just charged a tax, which was very cost efficient for them because they didn't have to maintain a bureaucracy. And this too became a very lucrative source of revenue for them. This is early Bombay. So from Bombay, Bombay became a major center of opium production. And in this period, you can see actually Malwa production of opium far exceeds that of Bengal. They would catch up later, both sides would catch up, but they kept competing with each other. But there's a huge difference between the way that opium was traded out of Eastern India and from Western India. In Eastern India, opium was completely a monopoly of the British. Only European merchants basically traded in it, so they got very, very rich doing that. Peasants got nothing, they were impoverished. They received almost nothing they received actually nothing for their product. In Western India, it took a completely different shape, simply because this Maratha Confederacy was able to resist the British. So the profits went much, much deeper into Western India. Local merchants, farmers earned sometimes 3 or 4 times as much as farmers did in Eastern India. And the results of this are still visible to this day. The relative poverty of Eastern India And the relative prosperity of Western India can, in my view, can be directly traced back to the differences in these patterns, because especially the mercantile networks of Western India profited hugely. And as we'll see, that laid the foundations of the modern Indian economy also. Most of this opium was destined for China. Now, by the early 19th century, even the late 18th century, it becomes the case that the Chinese become very worried about the public health crisis that they were facing at this point. So the Qing dynasty banned opium as early as 1729, and they reiterated this ban several times. But the British began this ingenious scheme of smuggling opium into China. And I'll explain a little more about that. So to go back to Eastern India, opium is transported from the factories in Patna and Ghazipur to Calcutta. This is Calcutta. Opium is exported by the East India Company from this port. And this is where the opium auctions were held in the 19th century. The building still exists. And ironically, it's the headquarters of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, which was actually founded by opium traders, which is now the world's largest bank. So you can see how deeply rooted modern banking and mercantile institutions are in the opium trade. So from Calcutta and Bombay, merchants would come to this Macau and then to Linton, this small island. In this period, the Chinese didn't really exert governmental control over this region. So the British and British, American, Indian merchants invented this incredible system. Because opium was a banned substance in China, they couldn't directly carry it into China. Just as, let's say Mexican drug cartels can't bring drugs directly into the United States. So they had to invent a system of smuggling. So what they would do is they would come to Linton Island and they would offload their opium onto local boats. So this is Linton Island today. You'll see it if you go from Hong Kong to Macau. This is where the opium wars were fought. But this was, in that period, the first major checkpoint of Chinese customs. So what the British and American merchants would do is that they would offload their opium onto other boats, which were actually anchored at Linton Island. So when they came here, when they came to the first checkpoint, their holds were empty. And they would say, opium? What opium? No, we don't have any opium. We just have some cotton or something. And then they would go on. To Whampoa. And this is Whampoa in 1835. And from Whampoa, they would make their way to Guangzhou. Because in this period, in China, only one city was allowed to trade with Westerners. And this was the city of Guangzhou. That's Guangzhou in the corner over there. That's Whampoa around about there. So they would sail up to this. This is the city of Guangzhou. And these are the boats at Linton Island that were receiving opium. This was a system actually invented by an American, Forbes, of the Forbes dynasty. So I mean, I'll show you more of that later. So these are the opium ships which are receiving the opium at Linton Island. And then this is Guangzhou in that period. Guangzhou is a very, very old city. It's actually older than Beijing. And they had these two lines of walls which were torn down in the early 20th century. And right over here, there was a foreign enclave. So that was where the merchants would go. And the American involvement in the China trade has been very well described by these two historians. Very, very, very good books. So John Jacob Astor was one of the earliest opium traders. He got very involved with opium, actually through the West Coast, because he founded a little town called Astoria, which is in Washington State right now. And that became his jumping off point to start trading with China via Astoria. And then they also discovered this new route for the opium trade. This is Joseph Peabody, one of the leading merchants of the 18th and 19th centuries. He made a huge amount of money. All those Peabody museums, etc. I'm sure you've seen signs of them everywhere, all financed with opium money. This was Stephen Girard, a leading Philadelphia merchant. Actually, he founded also a number of hospitals in Philadelphia that still exist. He was French, actually, and there were all these Indians who were involved in the opium trade, and a lot of the merchants who were involved in trading opium to China were Parsis. This was a small Zoroastrian group which settled in India, a very long time ago, when the Zoroastrian Persian Empire was conquered by Islamic invaders. So a few Zoroastrians escaped to India, where they founded this small mercantile community, which became incredibly prosperous. So this is Benjamin Wilcox, another major Indian merchant. This book describes the connection between American and Parsi merchants. They became very closely connected with each other. The Parsi merchants were based in this little city called Navsari initially. This merchant, actually, this is from a family that is still very, very important in Indian trade. Wadia just means carpenter. So the Wadias essentially began as shipbuilders. And then they got very heavily involved with the opium trade. This is Jamsetji Jijiboy, who was one of the richest men of his time. And this is a Parsi temple in Navsari. This is a library in Navsari where they actually invited me to talk about these subjects. Here he is painted again. This hangs at the headquarters of Jardine Matheson. I don't know if any of you have heard of it, a very leading Hong Kong company. This one hangs in. You're not allowed to. Only insiders are allowed to see this portrait, but somehow I smuggled myself in there. So this is the Jijiboy family home in Navsari. This was one of the richest men in the world, but he was born in this very, very humble place. It's now a kind of museum. And there he is in the family home, his cradle. And Navsari, also born in Navsari, was Jamsetji Nasirwanji Tata, who was a titan of Indian industry and so on, a very far-seeing figure. And he founded the Tata conglomerate, which is now the single largest employer in Britain. But the initial seed capital came from opium. And that's his birthplace. Again, very lovingly preserved, but as you can see, it's a very humble, the origins were very humble, but they were very entrepreneurial. And that's the back of his house. This is, I find, very interesting. If you go to Navsari, the vernacular architecture of the region is completely different from the hinterland, And in my view, it's really founded on this essentially Chinese model, which also influenced the architecture in Singapore and many other trading communities, Malacca, for example. So these are some other leading American merchants. Samuel Russell, who founded the Russell and Company, which became one of the leading agency houses in Canton. And this is the headquarters of Russell and Company in Guangzhou. And this is Russell House. He built this palatial house with his opium money in Middletown, Connecticut, and Wesleyan University, where my son studied. And I used to walk past this place and think to myself, wow, all this was built on a substance that was produced by impoverished Indians and consumed by impoverished Chinese. This is a very important figure, John Perkins Cushing. He became enormously rich in Guangzhou. And he came back to Boston as one of the richest men in America, a hugely eligible bachelor. And one of the reasons why he was able to succeed is that he was essentially mentored by this man who Westerners knew as Hao Qua. He was probably the richest man in the world at the time, the richest, this is another picture of Hao Qua. So Hao Qua really mentored John Cushing. John Cushing went to China when he was 16 years old. So he was completely clueless, but Hao Qua basically made him a multi-millionaire, and they remained very close throughout their lives. Through Cushing and through the Forbeses, Hao Qua and many other Chinese merchants actually invested in early American industrialization, which is a story I'll come to later. This is another great book about how American merchants amassed their money through opium. So where these merchants lived in Guangzhou was in the foreign enclave, which was also known as the 13 factories. This is at one corner of the old city. This is what the enclave looked like in those days. They were very luxurious, these houses. They were absolutely palatial. And each of them, as you can see, has a flag flying over it. The Americans eventually also had a flag. This is what the 13 factories looks like. This is another view with the American flag, as you can see. And that's where the foreign enclave would have been. It was destroyed during the Opium Wars. And now these are two very important figures, Robert Bennett Forbes and John Murray Forbes. Robert Bennett Forbes was actually the guy who invented the Linton system of smuggling. And it's important to remember that these guys went to China literally when they were 17, 18, 19. And they came back to America when they were in the 20s or 30s, and they came back with enormous amounts of money, and they became pioneers of American industry. In fact, early American industry is basically financed by opium. Robert Bennett Forbes later in his life. And so what's very interesting about this group of American merchants who went to China is that they were all part of a kinship group. Basically, the people we now know as Boston Brahmins. They were all part of this very tightly knit kinship group, and they operated just like a Chinese clan or like an Indian mercantile caste. So they operated very secretively. They only promoted each other. Basically, they promoted their nephews and cousins. And in that way, they kept all the profits to themselves. So this is a rare southern merchant who was involved in the opium trade. So the Browns of Rhode Island, they were one of the leading families involved in opium trading. And they founded, of course, Brown University. So the earliest railways in America were basically built by the Forbeses and these other Boston traders who basically built it with their opium money and with money that they received from Chinese merchants. So that's John Murray Forbes. That's where he put his money. So in this period, basically, we all know that Chinese workers helped to build the railways in America, but what is less well known is that actually the capital that made American railways possible was also basically from China. So, so that the China traders went into the railroads first. They were rich. They were looking for good domestic investments. And they had connections with both American and foreign capitalists, especially in Britain. And this was a major thing for American merchants because it educated them in international finance, international trade. It gave them many sort of non-material assets, just like it gave the Parsis. The reason that the Parsis became pioneers in Indian industry was because they learned from American and British merchants, basically while they were in Guangzhou. This is John Cleve Green, who's a great benefactor of Princeton. That's the John Cleve Green School of Science in Princeton, financed by Opium, of course. And even the architecture of the foreign enclave left its mark on New England. You can see it in these balconies and so on. So opium was really a way that America was able to transfer China's economic power to America's Industrial Revolution. So this whole idea that the relationship between China and India is a new one, China and the US is a new one, is completely false. I mean, in fact, China has financed American economic development for a very long time. This is Abil Abbott Lowe, one of my great favorites amongst the American opium traders. He was actually a Brooklyn guy. No, the family began in Salem, but like a lot of their families did. But he moved to Brooklyn, and he built a palatial house on Pierpont Street. And my kids actually went to this school, on the street where Abil Abbott Lowe built so much of his stuff. And this is a view of Brooklyn Heights circa 1852, very different today. And the Lowe family was a very interesting one because, Harriet Lowe, who was a part of the family, actually spent a long time in Macau and wrote a wonderful book about it. This is the book. Actually, it's a collection of her letters and so on. Washington Irving, the great American writer, was very much involved in the opium trade. He invested through his nephew, but his nephew was never able to really make a go of it. But this was the most important opium trader, Warren Delano Jr., Franklin Delano Roosevelt's grandfather. He made an enormous fortune in China. So people often think that the Roosevelt money comes from, I don't know what they think, but actually it comes from opium. So this is them all together, the old opium trader and his new family. This is another book about the Lowe family, and this is Abil Abbott Lowe. Now, Abil Abbott Lowe, he built the first Unitarian, and this is another strange thing about the opium traders. They're all incredibly devout. Devout Puritans, Protestants, they have this incredible sort of Puritan ethic. So this is a clipper ship built for Hakwa. And South Street Seaport was actually Abil Abbott Lowe's offices, in Manhattan. And this is the Lowe Mansion. He built the most expensive house in Brooklyn, which Matt Damon wanted to buy at some point. And his son actually bought up an enormous area in the Adirondacks. This is bigger than the Duchy of Liechtenstein. So, opium money is just so deep in America's soil that you can't even imagine taking it out. This is Lowe's Lake in the Adirondacks. This is Seth Lowe, who was mayor of Brooklyn. This is Abil Abbott Lowe's son, and he was president of Columbia University. This is Seth Lowe again. And he himself had so much money that he built the most iconic building at Columbia University, Lowe Library. And nobody knew the antecedents of this at Columbia. In fact, a group of Columbia historians asked me to go to Columbia and talk about it. So there I was, a random novelist from India, telling them about the history of opium at Columbia. This is the rotunda at Lowe Library. So Abiel Abbott Lowe was a very major figure in American industry, in American politics, and in American society. All right, so I think I'll just stop there. I was going to say something more about the Opium Wars, but I just wanted to give you some picture, some idea of the background of this, this extraordinary history, which really is so obscure and has been deliberately obscured over many, many decades. Thank you. Hello. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you very much for joining us today. We are all thrilled to have you here at Adelphi. It's really a treat for us. I'd like to just begin talking about Smoke and Ashes, and I just really enjoyed reading the book. It's fascinating. It really brings the history of the opium trade, kind of hidden history of the opium trade, up to the present moment, as you were demonstrating in this presentation, and how it shaped sort of covertly much of the things that we sort of take for granted about our contemporary world. I find that absolutely fascinating. We also get a glimpse into your writing process a bit. It's the research underlying, as you mentioned early in the presentation, the research underlying the Ibis trilogy. And I wanted to begin by asking you a question about the complexities and challenges of writing the historical novels about a history that has been largely occluded, whitewashed, and rendered invisible, largely.
Yeah, it was very, very difficult because, a fair amount has been written about the opium trade, but it's actually, considering how important it was, I think the research has been in some way negligible. But a curious thing is that my novels actually started off a new wave of research amongst historians, which was really interesting. The writing on it has been very minimal on opium, and the reason for that is not a lack of materials. In the British Library, there are like thousands of files on the opium trade because, the Victorians were great record keepers. So, there's an incredible amount of information, and as time goes on, I think more and more stuff will appear about the opium trade. But at that time, there wasn't very much, so I actually had to do much of the research myself. There didn't even exist a proper military history of the Opium Wars. So I had to literally reconstruct what actually happened from day to day during the Opium Wars.
I'm very curious about the research that you did into the opium factories, for example, that you mentioned in the presentation, and how that appears in the first of the trilogy, the Sea of Poppies, the scene of the Gazipur opium factory when DT enters that. So you went from a relatively scattered and disparate archival record to creating this kind of full-blown vision of that opium factory. Can I just ask you about that process of using an incomplete historical record to create the historical fictional worlds?
Well, what really helped were all these images, which I found. It gave me a visual idea of what the factory was like. Because often when I write, I use photographs, to imagine a place. I take a lot of pictures and then I try to imagine what the place was like, and that helps. But certainly these pictures gave me a really sort of very vivid sense of what it was like to be in that factory. But more than that, also J.W.S. MacArthur's book, he wrote a very graphic description of the opium factory. He was actually writing it for tourists, So it wasn't that hard to put it together. It's just that I had to find, I had to do a lot of work to find the stuff.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And the next question that I have is really about a concept that shows up both in Smoke and Ashes and consistently throughout Smoke and Ashes, but also shows up periodically in the Ibis trilogy, and it's the concept of free trade. It seems to be a concept or an idea that you keep coming back to. It's especially important in the second of the three novels, River of Smoke. And it gets recharacterized and recalibrated in different ways. Can you tell us about what your research into the opium trade, which I think interestingly you call the narco-colonial state, reveals about the discourse and logic of free trade?
Well, you have to remember that a lot of the British merchants who were trading in opium were actually Scotsmen, who'd actually studied at the University of Edinburgh, which was where Adam Smith was. And Adam Smith, they were very much influenced by Adam Smith's doctrines. So these were very early capitalists, if you like. So what they did was they justified the opium trade by reference to doctrines of free trade. They said where there is a demand, a supply will arise. So we are just providing the supply. Unfortunately, there are certain things that they didn't recognize. Addictive substances don't work like other kinds of commodities. Addictive substances create their own demand. And you've seen this in America with Purdue Pharma. The introduction of OxyContin generated enormous demand within a matter of years. And as with the opium trade, it was absolutely clearly thought out. It was used, to generate demand. So that was one fallacy, of the free trade arguments. The other fallacy, of course, is that the idea of free trade is that the government shouldn't interfere. But the biggest kind of interference any government can do is to make war, to protect merchants. And this is in effect what they did. And actually, it's a very interesting thing to see how the opium war came about, because they did what fossil fuel companies do today. The merchants so the opium war essentially starts around in 1839. When the Chinese tried to absolutely ban opium trading from Guangzhou. So in order to do that, they shut down the foreign enclave, they confiscated a vast quantity of opium from all the merchants who were there. So the foreign merchants then paid a guy called William Jardine, who was one of the great Scottish opium traders. They gave him this enormous sum of money to go to London and bribe all the politicians and journalists, which they very effectively did. They bribed them, they bribed the press, they created this huge outcry in the press, and Britain went on to attack China. Essentially, it sent its army and navy into China to force them to continue to import opium. It's really one of the really great historical crimes, but there are so many historical crimes, it's hard to count.
Well, you mentioned the connection to fossil fuel companies and environmental questions, and that's really where I wanted to take the next part of this conversation. Your environmental work has had a great impact on many people, certainly on my own research into the colonial origins of the current climate crisis. And in Smoke and Ashes, you draw parallels between the opium traders of the past and contemporary modern-day fossil fuel companies. Curious if you could talk a little bit about these parallels between opium traders and the fossil fuel companies, and what the current environmental movement can learn from studying the history of the opium trade.
So the opium trade really, if we say that it starts on a large scale in about 1780, it peaks in 1880, round about 1880, and then it carries on until round about 1906 and so on. So in the 1880s, after the Second Opium War, which happens in 1857, the Chinese were by this point thoroughly defeated. They faced a huge uprising within China. And they were really, as it were, on the back foot. But the Qing dynasty, which is often underestimated, was not actually, they were very good at certain things. And there was one prince of the Qing dynasty, a guy called Prince Gong, at least known as such to Westerners, who became the head of the Chinese foreign relations, like a foreign minister, but not by that name. And he was very, very effective in putting together an international anti-opium movement, basically. In this, he was helped by the fact that by this point, there was a major anti-opium movement also in Britain, also in America, and in India, and in many other parts of the world. And by the late 19th century, by the closing years of the 19th century, this movement had become extremely powerful, with a big representation also in the British Parliament and so on. Now, you have to remember that opium at this point in time is being traded and marketed by the most powerful entities in the world, which is the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, the French Empire. So these empires invested a lot of money in creating propaganda for the opium trade. And basically, they invented the whole playbook of denial, which first the tobacco movement used, and which now fossil fuel companies are using, to justify what they were doing and so on. Oh, it's not so bad for your health after all. Oh, addiction is very rare, that kind of thing, Isn't also supply, demand, etc. So this movement, essentially the anti-opium movement, which was led in many places by churches. In India, it was led by the Hindu reformers. It was led by many clerics across the world, but most of all, it was led by women's groups. In India, as well as in America, Jyotibai Phule, for example, of Maharashtra, was a major figure in it. And in fact, the Indian national movement is actually born out of the anti-opium movement, because Dadabhai Nauroji, who was a major independence campaigner, started with the opium movement. So within the space of like 30 years, this movement was able to force these empires to come to the table, and they forced them to actually accept limits on marketing opium. So I do think that if the fossil fuel movement can put together a huge coalition of that kind, bringing together church groups, other religious groups that basically don't agree on anything other than that. It could. I think it could actually have a very major impact.
I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions for our audience and students, but I would like to just ask you one final question, and it's actually a student question, or a combination of several student questions that I was getting over the past couple weeks. And it's about the relationship between the history of the opium trade and the current American opium crisis. And one of the things that, in hearing these questions from the students, it made me think of a point that you make in Smoke and Ashes when you say, we have a tendency in the United States, and I'm paraphrasing, so forgive me, please, if I missed this, but narcotics are being projected onto immigrants, aliens in foreign countries, and that a better understanding of the origin of the crisis would change that dramatically. And I'm curious what you could say to about the past and present opium crises.
Well, I do think it's very important for Americans to understand how deeply America has been involved in the opium trade, going back hundreds of years. That many of its most revered figures are in one way or another connected with the opium trade. So many presidential families, the Roosevelts are one, but also the Coolidges, and John Kerry, what's his middle name? Forbes. And so many of the institutions of American capitalism, like Forbes is almost iconic of American capitalism, Again, that money comes from opium. So I do think it's very important for Americans to understand when they create this narrative about Mexicans, let's invade Mexico and that kind of thing, that this is a homegrown problem. It's a problem. I mean, America had a heroin addiction problem in the 1860s during the Civil War. This problem again erupted in the 1880s. One of the most curious things about opium is that the Anglo world, basically British and American people, genuinely believed that white people could never use opioids. They really believe this, that, this is the Asiatic failing, they're degenerate, this, that, and the next. So they really believe that actually the white body is somehow immune to opium, And this actually has set them up in the long run for a really chaotic fall because, the heroin addiction crisis begins again during the Vietnam War. Then it comes back home. And again, I think if you look at what America is living through today, in many ways, it so eerily resembles the Chinese opium crisis of the 19th century. The patterns are eerily similar. In China, too, often opium was introduced in places by doctors, by people connected with healthcare, which is what has happened here. In the Appalachians, doctors, pharmacists were the most trusted people. And when they started distributing opium on this huge scale with OxyContin and so on, I think it led to a major cause of the lack of social trust that now pervades American life, And so many of these issues that appear political are actually deeply rooted in America's opioid crisis, meth crisis, cocainoid crisis. And it's very hard for me to see how these issues can be confronted.
Thank you very much for that. So why don't we go ahead and open it up to audience questions?
I just like one connection made, and that's how the Americans were allowed to become so involved in the opium trade. Was it the free trade ideology that you spoke about a few minutes ago as a key factor to the British allowing the Americans in?
Well, that's a very interesting question. So let me talk about that for a bit. Now, until 1789, Americans weren't allowed to trade with China. All trade between the British Empire and China was monopolized by the East India Company. Now think of America in 1789. It's surrounded by British colonies. Essentially, it has no one to trade with except China. So in 1789, within months of independence, Americans began to outfit ships to go to China. The first ship is actually called the Empress of China, and it's sent from Philadelphia. But what happens then is that in the beginning, Americans tried taking American trade goods to China. For example, there were various kinds of trade goods that they had. But they ran into a problem, the same problem that the British had run into in China. There wasn't much demand for their goods in China at all. They tried taking all kinds of sandalwood and furs. That's how Jacob Astor got into it. But the demand was very quickly exhausted. So that was when they were observing the British and the Dutch and what the British and the Dutch were doing. And the British and the Dutch were basically trading in opium. That's what their trade relations with China were founded on. So basically in the 1790s, the Americans, being very ingenious, they discovered another source of opium other than India, which was Turkey. So they set up these outposts in Smyrna and so on. And they created this whole new trade route for opium between Turkey and China. And in fact, many of these families were pioneers in that respect. These families essentially called themselves the Boston Concern. These were these interlinked clans of Boston merchants. So they started pioneering that trade route. But then after the 1812 war, again, during the 1812 war, there was a lot of trouble for American merchants. But after 1812, the Americans were allowed to start trading also in Bombay and Calcutta, and that's when they start getting it really deep into the opium trade.
Hello, my name's Ian, and I just want to thank you for coming. By the way, I was wondering if you could talk about the aftermath of the opium trade and war and its effect in India and the unequal treaties in China.
That's a subject which would take hours to expatiate on. But, let's just say this, 1839, the Opium War lasts for like 3 years between 1839 and 1842. And the effect of the Opium Wars is absolutely seismic. It completely upends China. It has in many ways the same sorts of effects as the American opioid crisis. People lose faith in their system of governance. People lose faith in traditional figures of trust like doctors, etc. And it leads to massive corruption, in the same way that's happening today in the United States. When you read about the Appalachian opioid crisis, what's really striking is how deeply it's penetrated into law enforcement.
To shorten it, could you just talk about the Western perspective and the aftermath?
Yeah, so what the West does is impose these unequal treaties. So the first of them is the Treaty of Nanjing, which is, imposed on China, whereby China has to open 5 ports to international trade. It has to cede Hong Kong, and basically all these ports become major centers for importing opium. Fujian becomes a major center for importing opium. Hong Kong is basically just a drug distribution center. That's what its economy was built on. Not just Hong Kong, Singapore similarly was built in order to facilitate the opium trade. So all the institutions of globalization in one way or the other are completely sort of founded upon opium. So really what this leads to is a major catastrophe for China, which they now call the century of humiliation and so on. And ultimately China begins to recover only in the 20th century.
And I think I'd ask a follow-up question actually as we're waiting for some other questions in the audience. The final novel of the Ibis trilogy focuses on the first Opium War and really focuses on a character that Kesari Singh, a sepoy. Could you talk a little bit about the role of the sepoy in the lead up and the first Opium War?
Sure. It's important to remember that, and this is something which is really completely neglected in India. People really don't even want to talk about it or remember it. But the first Opium War was financed by Indian merchants, like some of those pictures that I showed you. And it's fought by Indian soldiers, largely. The British sent a tiny force of like 5 or 6, I forget, I think it was actually 8,000, of which half were Indian sepoys. Now, so sepoys were basically, you might call them, they were mercenary soldiers, that the British recruited in India. They used these sepoys repeatedly as late as the Second World War. My father fought in the British Indian Army in the Second World War. It's a very long tradition of using mercenaries. Going back to the 17th century, millions of Indians fought in British wars. They had very few other sources of income, so they had to do this.
You mentioned that there's an affective dimension to this as well, that the sepoys, their heart was not in many of the battles, and it was really the wars of independence where against imperialism that they really started fighting as if their homeland, which it did indeed actually depend on it. Did that have a major impact on the military campaigns, do you think?
It did, because the sepoys, actually the majority of them came from exactly the opium-producing regions. They were Biharis and people from UP and so on. They were called Purabiyas because they came from Purvanchal. And it was exactly these people who revolted against the British in 1857. And one of the first institutions that they attacked was the opium factory in Patna. So opium was very much a dead center of the first Indian War of Independence, as we now call it. That was fought in 1857. And actually that was being fought at the same time as the Second Opium War, which again they were fighting over there. So this again had a very, very important effect on the economy of Eastern India, because before that, this area has always been a labor surplus area, Bihar and UP and so on. So historically, in the past, the major source of employment for people from this region was the military. India had many, many states, all of which had armies, and they would hire people basically from the military labor markets of Bihar and UP. After the British took over this region, they shut down the military labor markets. And so only they could hire people from this region. Only they could hire soldiers, these mercenaries. This again was a disaster for UP and Bihar. And that is the period in which large numbers of Indians begin to migrate, as indentured workers. Almost, the first indentured workers all came from Purvanchal. They were from this Bhojpuri-speaking region. They became replacements for slaves, essentially throughout the British colonies. But then after 1857, the British completely shut down their own armies. They completely shut out Biharis and people from UP. This was a catastrophe for them. It sent them into permanent poverty because unemployed people from Bihar and UP had nowhere to go. They had nowhere to turn. And this is one of the reasons for their long-term impoverishment. Because if you look at India today, the regions that actually became very prosperous in the late 19th century onwards into the 20th century, those regions all became rich through military recruitment. The Punjab is the best example. Punjabis became the major group within British Indian armies, Muslim Punjabis, Hindu Punjabis, Sikh Punjabis. And this is so ironic, because they started entering the British Indian Army after 1857. And, at that point, the British are already paramount throughout the world. There's no major threat to them. But these Biharis were the ones who fought the critical wars. In the 18th century. It was these poor Biharis who then get completely shut out. This is also a pattern of the Anglosphere. Anyone who helps them, they'll turn on them and impoverish them. This is one of the major reasons for why the Punjab is the richest, most powerful province in Pakistan. It's also one of the richest regions in India. Its prosperity was really built on the British, on being mercenaries. But again, one has to remember that the British Indian Army is a very peculiar institution because its whole history is one of rebellion. In the First World War in 1918, British soldiers revolted, Indian soldiers revolted in Singapore and actually took over all of Singapore for a couple of weeks. Then in 1942, when the Japanese invaded Malaysia and Southeast Asia, the major forces there were Indians. And they had this really climactic battle. It's called the Battle of Jitra. The British expected that the Japanese would attack from the south. But what the Japanese did is that they attacked from the north. So the British, they came through Thailand. So the British army was completely unprepared, to face the Japanese advance. And essentially, the British armies were destroyed at the Battle of Jitra. And that was when a huge number of Indians revolted against the British again and created their own army, which was called the Indian National Army. And this army was to play a very important role in Indian independence.
Beautiful, thank you. I think there's a question.
Hi, sir. My name is Vaishnavi. I had two questions about your writing processes. So, first one was, how do you decide which historical event you want to talk about in your books? And second is, I have seen that you balance historical accuracy along with fiction. So, where do you make that line? How do you balance both of them?
Well, I try to be as historically accurate as possible, Sometimes, especially in relation to Indian history, it's very, very difficult, And that's one of the major challenges that faces, anyone who's writing historical fiction in India. Because, suppose I'm writing historical fiction about, let's say, Tudor England, Everyone knows what clothes people wore. Everyone knows, what sorts of banquets they had and all of that. You have a mental image in your head. For Asia, generally speaking, that doesn't exist. No one knows, for example, what a Burmese court looked like. No one has a sense of what Asian soldiers were like. And these are great historical gaps that are very, very hard to fill. One of the weirdest things is that, as I said, millions of Indians fought as mercenaries for the British Empire between the 17th and the 20th centuries. But until the early 20th century, there is not a single account written by an Indian soldier, even though many of these soldiers were actually upper caste, they were literate. Not a single account. Similarly, there's not a single account written by an Indian indentured worker until the early 20th century. This is very, very strange, because if you think about it, Africans started writing slavery narratives way back in the late 18th century, and by the early 19th century, it was a genre, But we don't have any Indian accounts for these experiences.
Hi, my name is Swati Bhisé. I, of course, was fantastic. No words for it. But I had a quick question on, you talked about the Parsi community. I've also made a Hollywood film, Warrior Queen of Jhansi, but I wanted to know how, as a writer, you can bring about an understanding for this generation on what is real history from what was written from the POV of the British appointed Indians who were Oxford and Cambridge educated, and they followed the path of least resistance, including when you talked about Maratha history. Nobody knows that the Scindia family sold out to the British, which is why they have a kingdom today. While my film was on that, and I did meet Mr. Scindia, who came up to me, I know him. He said, I'll tell you the account. That is not how it happened. And they tried to stop my film in India. So I hear you, but I'd like you to tell us how you would inform an educated Indian that the Parsis also were the ones who gave the arms which destroyed Jhansi in its first war of independence, which my research has showed me, but nobody believes any of this. So who are the authors one can go to? How can one change the narrative in every country, whether it's in America, whether it's in India? How do we get this young generation to not say, I want to go to Harvard and Brown because people like me know the bases? Why not Adelphi?
Very good question. Let me say something I should have pointed out when I was talking earlier. The Parsis were the visible face of opium trading in India, but every major Indian mercantile community, Hindus and Muslims, were up to their necks in opium. I mean, effectively, they didn't have a choice. So Sindhis, Marwaris, Gujaratis, Marwaris were amongst the biggest opium traders. All these communities, many Maimans, etc., were all very deeply involved in opium trading. In fact, I mean, if you were from a mercantile background in 19th century India, you had no choice. Opium was the only game in town, so to speak. So they were all involved in it. The difference between these other communities and Parsis is that Parsis actually traveled to China. And the reasons for that, it's very intriguing. Throughout the whole opium story, we see it's partly a story of white adjacent groups. I mean, that's a word I'm using. Like the Parsis, the Armenians, and the Nyonya merchants of Singapore and Hong Kong. Nyonya Chinese merchants, Straits Chinese, you could say. So these groups formed alliances with Europeans and were able to trade them and enable them, because the Parsis basically provided, they linked up with Gujarati and Marwari mercantile networks in Western India, and through them they were able to provide opium to the British merchants. All this was taken over later by the Sassoons, who were Baghdadi Jews. So again, that was another white adjacent community. So that's another story. Now, how do we change the narrative? That's a much more difficult one, but I think the narratives are changing, I think these last 4 or 5 years have been really epical in the sense that these narratives of colonialism and slavery are now absolutely at the fore. I mean, if you just think of all the enslavers' statues that were thrown into the river and so on, you can sense there's a seismic shift underway.
We are being told to stop, so that will be it. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.